Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to have each of you with us today for our Power and People Working Conditions in the Texas Clean Energy Transition webinar. We have an exciting group of people here today to talk about what has been a very long labor of love in producing this report, and we're excited to dig into the findings. But first, maybe just a little bit about the organizations and that are involved, and a little bit about me and Texas Climate Jobs Project. This study, Power and People, started over 2 years ago as a collaborative effort to really understand working conditions in Texas clean energy industries. And it seeks to answer some really important questions that working people in Texas have. Texas, long regarded as the energy capital of the country, is experiencing a dramatic transition toward clean energy. And we, in this study, seek to answer a series of questions. What does it mean to have a good job in clean energy industries in Texas? What are employees reporting about their working conditions, both from a quantitative perspective and also a qualitative perspective? Um, what are some of the challenges that workers face in these industries? And what are our recommendations for what can be done to improve job quality in clean energy industries? This has been a collaborative effort with Organized Power and Numbers, who was an incredible partner in developing some really cutting edge methods that we'll talk about later. We'll hear from Kim Seelig, who is a leader at that organization, and will share more about their work in this program, and was also a collaborative effort with researchers at Cornell University. And you'll be hearing from them a little later as well. Myself, I'm the executive director at Texas Climate Jobs Project. My name is Bo Delp. We are a tax-exempt organization dedicated to advancing a pro-worker, pro-climate agenda here in Texas. We perform research, public education, and policy formulation to really center the voices of working people as Texas transitions. We were founded in 2021 by labor organizations who really wanted to have a bold climate plan that centered the voices of working people in the state. And so this research is an extension of that agenda and that mission. Since we've launched our organization, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, which is a historic series of investments here in Texas. We expect more than $66 billion to flow into the state by 2030 under the IRA alone. This is according to the federal government. And for the first time, what that legislation does is really put workers at the table to have a voice in what working conditions look like. So we're really excited, without further ado, to dig into the study and our findings. I want to introduce to you first the president of the Texas AFL-CIO, Rick Levy, who really, to his credit, was one of the driving visionary leaders behind Texas Climate Jobs Project, and excited to hear from him now. Rick?
Thank you so much, Bo. And thank you to all of you who are joining us from around the country and I believe around the world to look at this critical issue. And I just want to first thank Texas Climate Jobs and Organized Power Numbers in Cornell. This data that you are going to see today is so important as we chart the future of the energy industry here in Texas. And hearing directly from workers and putting it in the context of the Texas economy is a critical act. So thank you all for digging in and doing that. Texas always considers ourselves the energy capital of the world. And historically, that's meant we produce a lot of oil and gas and we refine a lot of petroleum products. And we have a very heavily fossil fuel based economy. And that's still true to some extent, but it's also true that Texas is going through a dramatic transformation where we now produce more wind and solar in Texas than any other state. and new technologies, thanks to the IRA and other federal initiatives such as hydrogen, geothermal, et cetera, are springing up all over Texas. We're also experiencing the same thing that people across the world are experiencing, which are an increase in heat-related weather phenomena, whether those hurricanes, whether that is drought, whether that is fire. And it's become increasingly clear that we all have to figure out as a planet how we're going to survive and how we're going to continue to live on this earth. And that means reducing carbon emissions. And so the question then is, how do we build the political will? How do we take decisive action to actually do that in a way that is going to really matter? And so much is produced here in Texas that unless we figure out how to decarbonize and power our country in Texas, we're not going to figure it out for the country. So to get there, what we have to do as we build this political will is understand that the biggest impediment towards taking strong action to protect the climate is the connection that people make in their minds between climate change efforts and job loss. And until we can break that link, until we can show that dealing with climate change is a job creator and not a job killer, then we will never build the political will we need to be able to save this planet. And so the whole purpose of the Texas Climate Jobs Project is to show that we can create good union jobs even as we transition our energy economy and put us in a position to save the planet. So what that means and why this study is so important is because traditionally environmentalists and others have said, well, there'll be all kinds of new jobs in the new energy economy. You know, you don't have to work in a refinery. You can be a solar installer. And I think what this study does is look at what does that mean to be a solar installer? What does it mean to have jobs in these industries? And when we look at what that really is, how do we get from a path to where these new jobs in these new energy industries are actually good, family sustaining, and to a large extent, union jobs. And so that is the context of why Texas and why now. Because unless we figure this out for Texas, we're not going to figure out from anywhere. And to figure it out for Texas, we have to show and demonstrate that the new energy economy, the jobs of the new energy economy are jobs that are going to really sustain people who have powered this state for generations. So with that, I just say that what we believe here is that we always think that if we can change what happens in Texas, we can change this country, and that the way things are is not the way things have to be. And this study can kind of lay out a real clear path to what we need to do to move forward. So thanks again, everybody, for attending. Thanks to the groups that did the work, and I'll turn it back to you, Bo.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn it over now to Kim Seelig with Organized Power in Numbers, who is going to be sharing just a little bit more about the report. But before I do, maybe I can just give you a little bit more context about the report itself before individuals jump into the details. This report was about 2 years in the making, and it really does seek to answer some fundamental questions about what makes a good job in this industry. And both from a quantitative and qualitative perspective, what are workers reporting in the field about their working conditions? And I'll let some of the other co-authors detail those. But we really did. We were able to visit so many solar and wind and supply chain sites to speak directly to workers and have them tell us about their working conditions. And I think what we found is really striking, and you'll be hearing about some of that in a moment. I'll save our recommendations for the end of the report, but for now, what I'd like to let you know is we were able to speak to over 1,200 workers across the state. And what you'll see is that this is a statistically significant number of people in relation to the number of people who work in the industry. And so we're very proud of this report and what it demonstrates to the world that Texas is going through this clean energy transition, And we're very excited about that clean energy transition. And we've got some work to do to ensure that the metrics that we think about when we think about job quality need to be improved. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kim Seelig with Organized Power Numbers to talk about the methodology.
Thank you so much, Bo. And thank you everybody here who is in attendance. We really appreciate your time and energy here to talk about our report. So I'm going to jump into the methodology section. Next slide, please. So for folks that have done worker organizing in the past, you may be familiar with the challenges that come with finding and interacting with workers at scale, right? In order for us to get a viable amount of survey responses and feedback from workers all across the state, we really tried to be creative with how we did our outreach. And a big way that we did that was through digital and online outreach. So in order to find workers, we try to generate leads for where folks may be working. We tried some strategies and tactics like geofencing. Geofencing is a way to serve targeted ads to people in a specific location. Maybe you have been at a hotel before and then you start to get advertisements for that hotel. It's just a common way that actually on the more like corporate side, advertisers target customers, and we tried our best to target workers for good for this project using that tactic. We also tried to buy commercial lists. Again, kind of thinking back to how people try to sell people products and try to use that information for good. There's a lot of information out there based off of people's professions. And so we did our best to try to find if there are any like quality vendors out there for us to purchase lists from. We also did some work in using FOIA requests. FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act. And if you can utilize state records or public records that are kind of run by state-run institutions to then get contact information from folks. So in related fields with state licenses, we tried to generate lists that way. Once we found, a viable enough pool of workers, we then worked to do data modeling. So we said, okay, all these folks that I've identified as solar or wind workers have all these things in common. Let's see if we can map that onto the entire state and see if we could generate plausible leads that way. We also use social media. There are lots of online Facebook pages and digital groups that people do use to circulate jobs in the green energy fields. And so we try to distribute those surveys that way. And then we also use referral programs, right? If we've confirmed that somebody is a worker, we want to, give them some support to engage their network. So those were the main ways that we built all of our digital lists. Next slide, please. So after that, how did we utilize all those contacts that we had? The primary way we did that was through text banking. So we reached out to folks and then identified if they were a green energy worker. If they said yes and that they were a recent one, we then would provide them with the survey, as well as a monetary incentive for their time and labor to complete the survey. We wanted to make sure, of course, we weren't saying, hey, have $20. Are you a green energy worker? We wanted to, make sure that we had a little bit of filtering before we offered that monetary incentive, but also understand, again, people's time is valuable and we wanted to reward that. So we did a lot of text banking. We also did a lot of phone banking. So for folks that were on the highest end of our model, or for people that finished the survey maybe halfway through, we then followed up with them over phone call. Again, we use social media, and then we also use QR codes over advertisements and also QR codes within our on-the-ground outreach as well. Next slide, please. So we did some field outreach, on-the-ground outreach. So we went to places where we knew these workers would be, right? So it is our understanding that when these sites are in construction, a lot of people will pick up their lives and move to where the work is, right? Especially, again, we were focusing on non-union green energy workers. So we were able to find people near developing sites, at motels, at gas stations, at diners. We were able to kind of leave our flyer for the survey around there in order to circulate this to workers. But again, we also wanted to make sure that we were collecting highly accurate data. So next slide, please. We had a lot of quality control methods in place. first and foremost, every single survey that we received was reviewed by at least 2 staff members to ensure that the answers were logical, that it made that we clearly, somebody was not just doing this for the incentive, because of course, when you provide an incentive, there is of course motivation to falsely fill out a form. So everything was staff reviewed. We also, based off of our survey platform, were able to identify the IP address that which the person filled out the survey on. So we were able to say, okay, is somebody in Texas? Are they in another country? Did that link get circulated around because, you know, someone found a way to get a whole bunch of gift cards over, online? So we wanted to make sure that we were tracking the location that these were being filled out in, because of course they should all be being filled out in Texas or potentially bordering states. We did learn that a lot of this, as people, you know, move from job site to job site, sometimes that does take them out of state into neighboring states, but we wanted to make sure there was a logical step there. We also made sure that every link that we provided over text and over the phone and with the QR codes, they were single-use links, meaning I could not fill out the survey 15 times and get 15 gift cards for my time and energy. I can only fill it out once, again, to ensure that we were collecting high-quality data. And then we weren't ever going to immediately disqualify any of these surveys that did not meet what our expectations were. Instead, we followed up with each person individually over the phone to, again, ensure that we were collecting accurate information for this report. All right, so thank you for listening to my methodology section. I'm now going to pass it over to Jillian Morley, who is one of the co-authors of this report and also a researcher at Cornell.
Thank you, Kim. Hello, everyone. My name again is Jillian Morley. I'm a researcher with Cornell's Climate Jobs Institute and a co-author on this report. And before jumping into the survey sample, I do want to extend my gratitude to all of the study participants for making this project possible. And thank you so much as well to all of you in the audience for making time to join us today. So after implementing the extensive quality control measures that were just outlined by my colleague, Kim, the team was left with 1,224 valid survey responses. We can see here that the industry of all workers surveyed is shared, and of these responses, 842, the majority of all participants, had conducted work in the solar sector. 223 had done clean energy manufacturing work, and 98 conducted work in the onshore wind sector. The remaining 61 respondents in the other category had conducted work in more than one clean energy sector or were employed outside of the clean energy manufacturing or construction industry entirely. This final group of respondents was omitted from this analysis. However, future research should examine the experiences of those working across multiple clean energy sectors. Moving on to the next slide, this shows the composition of survey respondents by race and ethnicity. The majority of survey respondents identified as Hispanic, and this is reflective of the racial and ethnic composition of the larger construction, installation, and production workforce in Texas, according to 2022 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. For each individual sector, the rate of respondents who identified as Hispanic came out to about 56% of those in the solar sector, 55% in the onshore wind sector, and about 66% in the clean energy manufacturing sector. So the precise racial and ethnic demographics of the clean energy industry are still difficult to confirm, and additional research should be conducted to understand whether this survey may have over or undersampled any categories. On the next slide, we can see the number of respondents by language of submitted survey. So survey respondents were given the option to complete the survey either in English or in Spanish, and significant differences in worksite experiences were observed between these two categories. For clean energy manufacturing workers, 16.6% opted to complete the survey in Spanish. That number was 17.3% for onshore wind workers. And for solar workers, the number of respondents that submitted surveys in Spanish was slightly higher at 30.9%. On this next slide, we have broken down the rate of survey responses by gender. For all of the surveys, as expected, the majority of respondents identified as male. However, the clean energy manufacturing sample yielded a higher rate of respondents that identified as female with a much more even split. And one final aspect of this survey sample that should be examined further can be seen on the next slide. Although all study participants were actively conducting work on Texas sites, variation was noted in the state of respondents' permanent residence. This is important. Worker transients in the clean energy industry will be an important issue to understand as the energy transition continues to move forward. Now, I will pass it over to the Climate Jobs Institute's research director, Avalon Hochspans, to review some of our results with you all.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm Avalon Hochspans, the research director of the Climate Jobs Institute at the Cornell ILR School. First of all, I just really want to thank all the workers that shared their experience with us. Today, I'm going to jump into just a few key findings focused on safety, benefits, and wages. Next slide. Starting with safety, we saw 1 in 4 workers have experienced work-related injuries on a clean energy Texas work site, and almost half of all workers surveyed have suffered a heat-related illness. Next slide. This varied by sector, where for the solar sector, we saw that 48% of our sample had experienced a heat-related illness, 26% saw or had an injury, and 7% saw a fatality on their solar Texas job site. Next slide. For wind workers, we saw a higher percentage experience heat-related illness, with 60% of the workers surveyed reporting that they experienced a heat-related illness, 31% reporting seeing or having an injury, and 4% seeing a fatality on their job site. Next slide. For clean energy manufacturing workers, 19% reported having a heat-related illness, 17% saw or had an injury, and around 5% saw a fatality on their job site. Next slide. Moving into benefits. Benefits are crucial for all workers across every industry, but are especially crucial to this sector as workers face increased risk of occupational hazards as well as precarity in their work. Of workers sampled across all sectors, 70% lacked access to workers' compensation insurance, 71 lacked retirement benefits, and 47 were without health insurance. Next slide. There was racial inequality in access to benefit, where we saw white solar workers were more likely to have access to benefits like retirement, health insurance, and workers' compensation compared to Hispanic and Black workers. Next slide. We also saw there was benefit access disparity by language spoken, where there is statistical significance for the solar and wind sector, where English-speaking workers were more likely to have access to benefits. Next slide. Now moving into wage. Wage issues included racial inequality, failure of payment, and low rates. Next slide. Looking at median wage for solar workers, we examined median wage for survey respondents with college degrees and found that they were consistently lower than the median union electrician wage rates, as well as the labor Texas solar wage rates. Next slide. Looking at racial disparity across pay, Black solar workers reported making over $8,000 less a year when compared to wage data reported by survey workers of other races. When looking at onshore wind, white workers had a higher median wage of over $10,000 more than Black workers or Native American workers. Next slide. For onshore wind workers, we also found that survey respondents had wage rates consistently lower than the BLS reported hourly median wage for wind turbine technicians across the state. Next slide. Lastly, for clean energy manufacturing workers, hourly reported wages were higher than BLS estimates for electric assemblers in the state. However, next slide. This does not paint the full picture of wage issues within clean energy manufacturing in the state, as nearly 1 in 6 clean energy manufacturing respondents reported that their employer had at one point failed to pay them, refused to pay them for hours they had worked. You can find more of these results in our full report, and I would strongly encourage any researchers who are on the call to further investigate working conditions in the clean energy and climate economy in their state, but the country at large. My team is happy to debrief anyone with the results with any group privately. And I also, just as a climate scientist, really want to echo the importance of centering working people in the climate transition. We need to rapidly reduce emissions and decarbonize, but also we need to reduce climate risk for millions of people. And the climate transition cannot happen at the sacrifice of the workers that are building the solutions. And now I'll pass it back to Bo, who's going to go back into recommendations.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. I really appreciate it. So as you can imagine, many workers face pretty significant challenges from health and heat-related illnesses and injuries, lack of benefits, lower wages, and this is particularly pronounced between white clean energy workers and communities of color. And our report digs into a few key solutions that we believe would help mitigate and address many of these challenges. In terms of the high labor standards that we think about when we think about high quality jobs, one of the things that we recommend in our report is binding community workforce agreements. Under the final IRS rules for compliance with bonus tax credits, community workforce agreements are prioritized in terms of assumed compliance with various labor standards. These binding agreements allow projects to be completed on time, and studies show under budget, and also put workers at the table in order to negotiate wages and working conditions before the project is complete. In addition, concepts like Justice 40 are able to be incorporated into these agreements as well to ensure that surrounding communities, and particularly disadvantaged communities, are able to participate fully in the installation of these projects, whether they be solar or wind. In addition, we recommend that employers adopt and that local policymakers adopt labor peace agreements to ensure that workers have a free and fair process to decide for themselves whether or not they want to form a union without employer interference. In addition, as President Levy said at the beginning of this call, there are so many oil and gas workers in the state of Texas, and we need to be able to demonstrate to them through the development of these projects that there are jobs to transition into that are comparable in terms of wages and benefits. And clearly, there are many cases where that is not happening. And so we need to support legislation such as the American Energy Worker Opportunities Act that provides a clear pathway for individuals working in the oil and gas industry to secure a planned transition that provide things like guarantees for wages and benefits as individuals move into these new jobs over time. One of the additional recommendations that we make is very specific to updating and strengthening and enhancing the IRA's regulations around bonus tax credits. One of the findings that we had in the study is of all of the solar and wind workers that we spoke to, only 7 identified as apprentices. And what our report shows is that while we don't get into project-specific data, what we're seeing in Texas is an industry-wide failure to create career pathways for individuals to get into registered apprenticeship programs that give them the lifelong tools that they need in order to have a career in these industries. Part of the challenge is that project owners are not required to disclose to the workers or the broader public that they will be pursuing tax credits that would require them to meet certain registered apprenticeship standards required by the Internal Revenue Service under the final rules. We believe that what needs to happen is the rules need to be enhanced to require public notice, especially to workers, so that they know what they're entitled to on the site, both in terms of wages for Davis-Bacon wages, prevailing wages, and for apprenticeship requirements. In addition, one of the things that we want to see in connection to that is increased monitoring. We're very excited that the federal government has prioritized tax credits to serve as a catalyst for clean energy development in the state of Texas. We are also excited, as I said at the outset, that for the first time, because there are requirements associated with these tax credits for Davis-Bacon and also for apprenticeship, we're very excited that workers are being centered in the conversation. However, we need to make sure that these requirements are adequately monitored. And so in our report, we lay out in detail what we would like to see happen, modeled after the Paycheck Protection Program that we saw during COVID, public disclosure of companies that are pursuing these bonus tax credits so that the public can understand how public dollars are being spent, and to ensure that they're being spent responsibly and in a way that further the spirit and goal of the Inflation Reduction Act to create good family-sustaining wages, benefits, and career pathways through registered apprenticeship. Finally, we need, at the state level, we need state leadership to stop interfering with local efforts to support workers who are experiencing heat-related illnesses. And so we've seen previous attempts here in Texas to interfere with local efforts to ensure that workers are able to get rest after working in the heat all day. And as you will see from the data in our report, workers are experiencing heat-related illness when they're out in the field all day installing solar panels and attaching them to the racks. So we need to be able to ensure at a local level that these workers are protected. And at a federal level, we need to ensure that OSHA is able to create a robust heat-related rule that I know has already, that rulemaking process has already started. Finally, we need to ensure broadly that policymakers at the state and local level are incorporating this data into their decision-making as they look for new and innovative tools to further catalyze the development of clean energy. We at Texas Climate Jobs Project are very strong supporters of the state reducing its carbon emissions and getting to a place where we are producing clean energy in accordance with the national goals that the United States has set. At the same time, we can't leave workers behind in this transition. We need to ensure that their voices are centered and that perspective needs to be reflected in all of the innovative policy solutions that are being proposed moving forward to develop clean energy across the spectrum, whether it's building decarbonization or utility scale projects. And now I'm going to hand it over to Kim.
Thank you so much, Bo. So now we're going to move into the questions and answers portion of our webinar here today. If you had not had a chance to submit a question that you're burning to ask our team of panelists, please submit it in the question and answer portion of your Zoom chat. And as we wait for folks to go in, all appear on the screen. We're all here now. Fabulous. We do have some questions already queued up from folks that were asking them along the way. So I want to start off here with our first question, which I think is a little bit of a clarifying question here, make sure we're all on the same page about what is in this report. And this is for industry workers surveyed. What is considered to be a part of the category, quote, clean energy manufacturing? Avalon, it looks like you're at the ready for this, do you mind answering that one?
No, I can pass it to Bo, whose team led the surveying of that.
Sure. What I would say is out of the to protect the workers that were being responsive to the survey, we're not going to be disclosing a lot of information about what the clean energy supply chain employers were that we spoke to.
Thank you for that clarification. All right, and then moving on to our next question. What are the most pressing safety concerns for workers in the solar and wind sectors?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that, or Jillian, if you want to hop in. Jillian, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think what really stood out to me for solar workers in particular was the risk of heat-related illness. And that stood out to me for more than one reason, not just because it was so high, but also because there is hope in the fact that breaks were associated with lower rates of heat-related illness. And that is something that we can go in and recommend and hopefully help prevent among these workers. Thank you.
I would also just say proper training leads to less safety hazards. So making sure that solar workers on solar sites have proper electrical training, whether they're a trained electrician, this will help prevent deaths in terms of electrification. And then for wind workers, onshore wind workers, there is a risk of falls and height-related injuries and deaths.
Oh,
I would point to two things. One, at Texas Climate Jobs Project, we view income inequality, racial inequality, and climate change as three deeply interconnected crises that many workers face in Texas. And it was very striking to us how pronounced some of the disparities were around income and access to benefits based on whether or not someone responded to the survey in English or in Spanish, or someone who identified as African American or Hispanic on the form. And so to me, that is a huge crisis. And I just want to say that, we had field staff that spent a lot of time. We talked about the methodology earlier. We had field staff that spent a lot of time in small towns across Texas, speaking directly to workers near the job site, at gas stations and other places that we thought workers might be, who identified as solar and wind workers. And what we learned from many of these workers, that they are facing a crisis. They move from job to job. There are these deep income disparities depending on how an individual identifies, by race, by ethnicity, by gender. And this is going to be something that I think has to be addressed. And that we know things like collective bargaining are so good at addressing, in terms of being an equalizer for pay and benefits, no matter who you are or what your background is. Having access to a high quality job through something like collective bargaining. I think the other thing that really stuck out to us in the findings that I alluded to in the recommendations is the few individuals that identified as apprentices on the site. We are so thankful that the Inflation Reduction Act creates very clear, robust standards for apprenticeship utilization for project owners that are pursuing bonus tax credits. For example, if a project owner decides to pursue the 30% ITC bonus tax credit, they are required to ensure that 15% of the total job hours performed on that site are performed by registered apprentices. There are other rules associated with that bonus tax credit that are directly tied to registered apprenticeship. And this was a striking finding for us. And I think there's going to be the need for continued evaluation at the project site level to ensure that the spirit of the IRA and what the IRA does so well in guaranteeing, these projects not just being a catalyst of clean energy, but also creating career pathways for individuals from disadvantaged communities to be able to get into a registered apprenticeship program and have access to decent wages and healthcare and a retirement that allow them to take care of themselves, take care of their families. So this was a really striking finding that we had in the industry that we're going to be monitoring very closely.
for all that. That was really helpful context there. right, so we do see there are some more questions coming in the chat. I do always want to share that if we don't have the space to get to your question at the end, or if you come up with a question, after this webinar ends, you could always email info@txclimatejobs.org, and we'll be happy to follow up with any questions that you may have. All right, so our next question is, what was the average size of the solar projects or the solar workers? Wondering if rooftop solar installers were included or only workers on large-scale solar projects.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this study focuses only on utility scale solar in Texas for non-union solar workers for the solar sector specifically.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions here. All right, and then let's grab this. All right, so how can we ensure that the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act reach workers in the form of better wages and conditions?
I can try to take that one. I think a couple of things need to happen. In the final rules that the IRS recently published around the bonus tax credits, we certainly welcomed the fact that the IRS prioritized binding community workforce agreements as assumed compliance. In other words, if a project owner adopted a pre-hire agreement, a community workforce agreement, then the IRS would presume compliance with the various labor standards necessary under the IRS tax credits. So we welcome that and really do encourage employers to adopt those measures, both because they help with compliance with IRS rules, but also because they put workers at the table in order to be able to have a voice and a say in what their working conditions look like on the site, to address things like heat-related illness, like lack of health care, like pay disparities between people who come from different backgrounds. So that's key. I think in addition, we're going to need to make sure that the federal monitoring of these tax credits are being implemented. In Texas, we have a deep history of seeing labor standards written down on paper, but then not enforced. And so what we've learned over the years is that it's one thing to have requirements, and it's another to enforce those requirements. And so we need to make sure that the rules on the books under the bonus tax credits for Davis-Bacon and the apprenticeship utilization requirement are properly enforced. And part of that for us means informing the public that certain projects are pursuing those tax credits. Workers on the site need to know what they are entitled to on the site. And that's very standard with, other, the Fair Labor Standards Act and even Davis-Bacon on prevailing wage projects. There's postings and notices that these are the rights that you have on this site. Currently, under the bonus tax credits, that is not a requirement. And so it's very possible that a worker on the site simply does not know that they are entitled to prevailing wages on this site, or that a certain percentage of the job hours must be performed by a registered apprentice. And this is concerning to us. So proper enforcement and transparency, I think, are two very concrete ways that we can ensure that these taxpayer dollars that are flowing into Texas really do maximize community benefit in these communities where all these projects are being built.
Alrighty, and I think we have time for just one more question from our chat. And the question is, the federal government is experimenting with attaching strings, in parentheses, community benefits, encouraging project labor agreements, workforce training, in parentheses, to offshore wind leases. Based on what you have learned from this incredible study, what do you think needs to be in place on the ground and on the front end to ensure that the intent of those policies actually benefit the workers who will eventually build out this industry.
I think that's a great question for Rick or Bo, not to put them on the spot, but
Hey, I'll come back out of my hibernation and just say that, you know, it's the same. It's a really perceptive question, and because it deals with an entirely new industry that's being formed, and it's being formed with significant tax dollar support. It's the federal government has the opportunity to shape the formation of this industry with the leases and with the ability to kind of direct it in certain ways. And in that way, it's similar to the IRA. It's similar to the hydrogen grants. It's similar to all of this investment that's being leveraged with public taxpayer money. And it is incumbent upon us to take it at this moment and say, as we shape the future of these industries, is it going to be a low road industry where employers just take this money, develop the technology with our support, and then all the profits accrue to them? Or is it going to be, we're going to set the ground rules from the very outset, that in order to get this money, we have to ensure that that everyone is going to benefit, that the community is going to benefit, and not just the wage standards on the jobs itself, but training and giving people access to these skills that haven't had an opportunity to have it before. And whether that's through pre-apprenticeship grants, which the Texas Climate Jobs Project is running in conjunction with these organizations and with the building trades, to provide a real entry point for folks that have been excluded from this work for too long. I think that the message with offshore wind and all of this is we have to think in a much bigger and broader term of that this is actually setting industrial policy for this country. It's not just about an industry, and it's saying now is the time for our country to say that as these new technologies are developed, workers have to be the ones who benefit too. So that's what needs to happen, and it needs to be clear, and it needs to be strong, and workers must be able to see themselves and their interests in the new energy future.
I think that's exactly right. And I would just add one small point to that, which is, you know, we've talked a lot today about some of the things that we've seen in the construction phase, you know, a solar and wind installation site. I think one of the things that's needed on the front end is small but really important, which is, you know, at this time in this country, public support for labor organizations is at an all-time high, around 70%. And, you know, employers that are moving into this space, particularly, of course, in the construction side, but also in the manufacturing and operations and maintenance side and supply chain, I think employers, what we need on the front end to answer the question is a curiosity and a responsiveness to that support, and to employees that are looking to have a collaborative relationship with their employer that includes things like collective bargaining to hammer out what a good job can be in that particular industry. We know unionized workplaces have fewer accidents and have less income and racial inequality than non-union employers. And so I think one of the things that's needed is for policymakers and for employers to lean in to that support for collective bargaining that we're seeing across the country, because it does not have to be adversarial. You know, workers and employers and policymakers can come together to set an industrial policy in this country that is collaborative. That puts workers at the table, but also ensures that policy is being formulated in a way that catalyzes successful business. And so I think that's something that's going to be needed, particularly on the front end, because for every solar and wind project that's being installed in Texas, we're seeing solar panel manufacturers, we're seeing wind turbine manufacturers, we're seeing steel racking manufacturers, and of course, companies that are maintaining those projects with full-time jobs over the long haul. So it's an exciting time to be in the state, but I think we've got to really get clear on the kind of economy that we want to have.
Thank you for that. I want to thank all of my fellow panelists for your time and energy in today's presentation, as well as question and answer section. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Bo to close us out.
I want to thank everybody for the time today. As it was stated earlier, if in reviewing the report you have any questions about the methodology, about the findings, we dropped both the report and our email in the chat. Please do take a moment and reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. We would love to hear about research projects that you're involved in and see if what you're finding. Just again, I want to express gratitude to everybody who was involved in this effort, from the digital outreach to the field staff that were speaking directly to workers on these sites, to the number crunching that happened behind the scenes, to the labor organizations that allowed us to interview union solar and wind workers to understand what it means to have a good job in these industries. So it took so many organizations and people to make this report possible, and we hope it's the beginning of a very productive conversation for Texas and for the country. So thank you so much for taking the time, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.